My grandmother remembered a time before there even was an America. She remembered when we were all English. When the king across the ocean was our king as well. When no one had ever heard the word American except as a kind of insult. Her name was Prudence. Prudence Hartwell before she married. She was born in 1762 in a small village just outside Boston. She lived to be 86 years old. She died when I was 9 years old. That was enough time. Enough time for her to fill my head with stories. Stories about a world that no longer exists. A world from before this country was born. My name is Martha Ellen Whitmore. I was born in 1839 right here in Concord, Massachusetts, the same ground my grandmother walked on as a girl. The same hills, the same rivers, the same old trees. Some of those trees were already standing when my grandmother was born. Some of them are still standing now. I am 90 years old today. 90 years. I have lived long enough to see things my grandmother could never have imagined. Automobiles, telephones, airplanes moving through the sky like metal birds. The world has changed so much since I was a girl, and it changed even more between my grandmother's time and mine. But the stories she told me, those never changed. I still carry them with me just as she spoke them. Her voice is in my head, clear as a bell, even after all these years. I can close my eyes and hear her. I can see her face, wrinkled and gentle, leaning close to mine as she whispered about the old days, the days before America. She used to say, "We did not know we were making history. We were only living our lives, only trying to survive." My grandmother was 14 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed. 14, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to remember what life was like before. She told me about the world she was born into. A world where everyone was a subject of the king, King George, as they called him, the third of that name. She said his picture hung in the meeting house when she was a little girl. She said they prayed for him every Sunday. They prayed for the king's health, the king's wisdom, the king's long life. He was their ruler, as natural and fixed as the sun in the sky. She said, "We did not think of ourselves as Americans. That word meant nothing to us. We were English people who happened to live in Massachusetts. We were subjects of the crown, just like the people in London or Liverpool. We simply lived farther away." I asked her once what it felt like to be English. She laughed at me. She said, "It did not feel like anything, child. It was just what we were. You do not feel yourself breathing, do you? You just breathe." Being English was like that. It was the air they lived in. They did not think about it. She told me about her childhood, about the years before the trouble began. She said those were peaceful years, quiet years. Her father was a farmer and a cooper. He made barrels for the merchants in Boston. Good barrels, she said. Strong barrels that did not leak. He was known for his skill throughout the county. Every few weeks, her father would leave before sunrise, loading his wagon with barrels he had made. He would travel the 12 miles to Boston, sell his barrels to the merchants, and return the next day with coins in his pocket and goods from the city. Tea, sugar, cloth her mother could not weave herself, small comforts that made life a little easier. She loved the days when her father came back from Boston. He always brought something for the children. A ribbon for her hair, a penny whistle for her brother. Once he brought a small mirror, the first one she had ever seen. She remembered staring at her own reflection, amazed that such a thing could exist, amazed that she could see herself the way others saw her. They lived in a small house made of wood and stone, with a large fireplace in the center that warmed the whole place. She shared a bed with her 2 sisters, all 3 of them pressed together under quilts their mother had sewn. In winter, she said, you could see your breath inside the house. The fire would burn low during the night, and by morning there would be frost on the inside of the windows. The frost formed patterns on the glass, she said, beautiful shapes like ferns and flowers. She would trace them with her finger before they melted in the morning light. She remembered the smell of that house, wood smoke and tallow candles and whatever her mother was cooking in the big iron pot. Beans most days or porridge, sometimes salt pork if they had it. She said they were not rich, but they were not poor either. They had enough. In those days, having enough was all anyone hoped for. Some days were different from others. Some days they went to the meeting house. All of them wore their best clothes. Her father in his good coat, the one he saved for Sundays and special times. Her mother in her gray dress with the white collar. The children scrubbed and combed until they looked polished. The meeting house was cold in winter and hot in summer. The benches were hard wood with no cushions at all. The sermons were long, sometimes 2 or 3 hours. She said her legs would go numb and her stomach would growl, and she would count the knots in the wooden beam above her head to pass the time. But she also said there was something lovely about it. Everyone together, the whole village praying and singing and listening. It made them feel connected, made them feel part of something bigger than themselves. After the service, families gathered outside to talk and share news. The children played while the adults spoke about crops and weather and the happenings beyond their village. That was how news traveled then, by word of mouth, moving from person to person, village to village. Her mother spun wool and wove cloth. Every woman did, she said. You could not buy cloth the way you can now. You made it yourself or you did without. She learned to spin when she was 5 years old, sitting beside her mother, watching the wheel turn. By the time she was 8, she could spin thread as fine as any woman in the village. She told me about the games she played as a child, simple games. Hoop and stick, blind man's bluff. In summer they raced through the fields barefoot, their dresses pulled up to their knees. In winter they slid across frozen ponds, laughing, falling, and sliding again. There was no school for girls, she said. Her brothers went to the village schoolhouse and learned their letters and numbers, but girls stayed home. Girls learned what they needed from their mothers: how to cook and clean and sew and spin, how to save food for winter, how to make soap and candles, how to bring a baby into the world, and how to prepare the dead. She said they learned the things that mattered, the things that kept a family alive. But her father taught her to read, almost in secret. He would sit with her by the fire after her mother had gone to bed and show her the letters in his Bible, the only book they owned. She learned to read from the book of Genesis, sounding out the words by candlelight while her father nodded and corrected her. She said it was their secret, not because it was truly forbidden, but because it was unusual. A girl who could read. Some people would have thought it strange, would have wondered what her father was doing, filling a girl's head with letters when she should be learning to make cheese. I am glad he taught her. So glad. Because those words she learned, those stories from the Bible, she passed them on to me. I passed them on to my children, and they passed them on to theirs. A chain of words reaching back through the generations, all beginning with my grandmother and her father, sitting by the fire in a world that no longer exists. She remembered the Stamp Act of 1765 when she was 3 years old. She did not understand it then, of course. She was too young. But she remembered the feeling in the village, the anger and the fear. She remembered her father coming home from Boston with a heavy look on his face, speaking to her mother in low voices by the fire. She said, I did not know what stamps were. I did not know what taxes were. But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it. Children can sense those things even when they do not understand them. As she grew older, she understood more. The tea taxes, the soldiers in Boston, the tension that kept growing like a storm on the horizon. She said, you could feel it in the air. Everyone was angry. Everyone was afraid. Everyone was waiting for something to happen. She was 12 when the Boston Massacre happened in 1770. She remembered her father coming home with the news. Soldiers had fired on a crowd. People were dead. Colonists killed by the king's own men. She said that was when everything changed. That was when people began to wonder if maybe they were not English after all. If maybe they were something else, something new. She told me how the word American began to mean something different after that. Before, it had been an insult, a word the English used to remind the colonists they were lesser, provincial, not fully civilized. But after the massacre, people began to use it with pride. They claimed it. They started saying, yes, I am American, and what of it? Her father was one of them. He began calling himself an American, began talking about rights and liberty, things that once seemed distant and unreal. Her mother worried. She said he would get himself hanged, but he did not care. He said some things were worth dying for. She told me about the night of the tea party, December of 1773. She was 11 years old. Her father went to Boston that day, even though her mother begged him not to. He came home late, smelling of salt water and something else. Tea, she thought. She said he smelled like tea. He did not tell them what he had done, not then. But years later, when she was grown, he admitted he had been there on the ships, throwing the tea into the harbor. He had been one of them, one of the men who took part in it all. They dressed as Indians and threw the king's tea into the water. She said he was proud of that act until the day he died. He always said it was the most important thing he ever did, more important than any barrel he ever made in his life. And then the war came. She was only 14 years old when the first shots were fired. It was April 1775, Lexington and Concord. Right here where I am sitting now. Right here on this very ground. She said she remembered that morning clearly. She remembered waking up to the sound of church bells ringing, ringing, ringing. These were not the normal Sunday bells. This ringing was different. It was sharp and urgent and full of fear. Her father was already awake, already dressed, already loading his musket. Her mother was crying openly. Her brothers were pulling on their boots as fast as they could. Everyone was moving at once, shouting, praying, rushing around the house. She said, "I did not understand what was happening. I only knew it felt like the world was ending. That is truly how it felt, like everything was coming apart." Her father and her two older brothers left that morning. They marched toward the sound of gunfire. She stood in the doorway with her mother and her sisters and watched them disappear down the road. She did not know if she would ever see them again. But they did come back. All three of them returned that night, covered in dirt and completely worn out, but alive. Her father had a deep cut on his arm from a British bayonet. Her oldest brother had fired his musket so many times that his shoulder was dark with bruises. They sat by the fire and told the women what had happened that day. The British had marched out from Boston during the night, heading for Concord to seize the colonial weapons stored there. But Paul Revere and others had spread the warning. The militia was ready. At Lexington there had been a tense standoff. The British ordered the militia to disperse. Someone fired a shot. No one ever knew who fired first. Then everything broke loose. There was shooting, screaming, and men falling to the ground. Her father said he saw a boy die that morning, a boy not much older than her own brother. He was shot through the chest by a British musket ball. He fell and never got back up. Her father never forgot that boy's face. He dreamed about it for many years afterward. But the militia fought back. At Concord, at the bridge, they stood their ground. They fired on the king's soldiers. They drew blood and then chased the redcoats all the way back toward Boston, firing at them from behind stone walls and trees. She said, "That night we were not English anymore. That night we became something else. We did not have a name for it yet, but we knew we were different. We knew there was no going back." Her mother made a thin soup that night from the last of the salt pork and whatever vegetables she could find. They ate quietly, too tired and overwhelmed to speak. Outside, the night was calm. The guns were silent, but everyone knew it was only the beginning. The war lasted 8 long years. 8 years filled with fear, hardship, and never knowing what tomorrow might bring. She told me about the hunger. The winters when there was not enough food, and the summers when British ships blocked the harbors so nothing could come in. She said the first winter of the war was the hardest of all, the winter of 1775 into 1776. The British were still in Boston, surrounded by the colonial army, but nothing was settled. Everything felt uncertain. Would there be peace or more fighting? Would the king send more soldiers, crush the rebellion, and hang the leaders as traitors? Her father was gone much of that winter serving with the militia. Her mother ran the farm with the help of the children and a few neighbors. They slaughtered one of the pigs earlier than planned because they did not have enough feed to keep it alive through the winter. They ate very carefully, rationing every meal and making every bite matter. She remembered the constant hunger, the hollow feeling in her stomach that never fully left. She dreamed about food, about warm bread and fresh butter, and all the things they could not have. That year she learned that hunger changes a person. It changes how you think, It makes you thankful for every meal, no matter how small. Spring finally brought some relief. The British evacuated Boston in March of 1776. Her father came home thin and exhausted, but alive. The war was not over, but it had moved south to New York and beyond. For a short time they could breathe again. Still, the war was never far away. Soldiers marched through their village on their way to distant battles. Wounded men returned, missing arms or legs, their eyes filled with memories they could not escape. News arrived of victories and defeats, of battles with strange names in places they had never heard of. She told me about the soldiers who camped in their fields. They called themselves American soldiers now. They were ragged, thin, and desperate. Her mother gave them whatever food she could spare. Sometimes it was very little. Sometimes it was only a cup of water and a prayer. She remembered one soldier especially, a young man barely older than she was. He had a fever and was too sick to march with his unit. Her mother took him in and put him in the bed where her brothers usually slept. For 3 days she cared for him, feeding him broth and cooling his forehead with wet cloths. On the 4th day he died. They buried him behind the barn in a grave her father dug by lantern light. They never learned his name. He had been too sick to speak, too weak to tell them who he was or where he came from. She said somewhere there was a mother who never knew what happened to her son, who never knew strangers buried him with prayers and tears. That is what war does. It takes people and makes them disappear forever. She also told me about the time the British marched through their village. Redcoats moving in formation, drums beating, bayonets shining in the sun. She hid in the root cellar with her sisters, listening to the boots marching overhead, holding her breath and praying they would pass by. The cellar was dark and damp and smelled of dirt and old potatoes. Her youngest sister was crying softly, and she tried to quiet her with her hand. Her other sister whispered prayers again and again, like a charm against danger. Above them she could hear the soldiers, the steady rhythm of their march, the clatter of their gear, and voices shouting orders in English that sounded strange and unfamiliar. Her mother stayed upstairs. She insisted on facing whatever came. She stood in the doorway and watched the soldiers pass. Later she said that a young officer tipped his hat to her. It was a small, polite gesture, almost ridiculous in the middle of a war. She never forgot it. The soldiers passed through without stopping. The village was too small to matter, but the sound stayed with her. The sound of enemy boots on her father's land. The sound of an empire marching through her childhood. For years afterward, she could not hear drums without flinching. That sound carried her back to the cellar, back to the darkness and fear, back to the feeling that the world could end at any moment. She was 21 years old when the war finally ended. She had spent her entire youth surrounded by war, fear, and uncertainty, and then suddenly it was over. They had won. The impossible had happened. The colonies had defeated the greatest empire in the world. The news came slowly at first, rumors and whispers, and then at last confirmation. Yorktown had fallen, Cornwallis had surrendered, the war was finished. America had won. She said she did not believe it at first. None of them did. After so many years of fighting, peace seemed unreal. They waited for bad news, for the British to return and attack again, but they never did. Instead, celebrations began. At first they were small and careful, as if too much joy might break the peace. Later they grew larger as the truth settled in. Bonfires burned on hilltops visible for miles. Church bells rang from every steeple. Strangers hugged each other in the streets. She remembered the fires, the bells, and the people dancing. She remembered her father crying. She had never seen him cry before, but that day he wept like a child. Her mother cried too, but her tears carried something else, maybe relief, maybe sorrow for all that had been lost and could never be restored. The war had taken so much from them. Even in victory, the cost could not be forgotten. He said, "We did it. We really did it. We made a new country." And that was true. They had made a new nation out of nothing. Out of 13 colonies that barely knew one another, out of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who had always thought of themselves as English. She remembered the years after the war, the difficult years when they tried to figure out how to be a country. No one knew if it would work. Some wanted another king. Others wanted something new, something the world had never seen before. She was 27 when they wrote the Constitution. She remembered hearing about it. This document meant to bind them together, 13 states under one government. It seemed impossible, almost like a miracle. Her father lived long enough to see George Washington become the first president. She said he cried again that day. He prayed and thanked God that he had lived to see such a moment, a president instead of a king. A man chosen by the people, not born to rule. It was everything he had fought for, everything he had hoped for. He died 3 years later in 1792, peacefully in his bed, surrounded by family. His last words were about freedom, about how precious it was, and how every generation would have to fight to protect it. She carried those words with her for the rest of her life. She passed them on to her children, her grandchildren, and finally to me. She said, "I had no idea if it would last. We thought it might fall apart in a year or 5 or 10. We did not know we were building something that would still stand 100 years later. We were only trying to survive." My grandmother lived on with that belief, carrying the weight of history in her memory. She lived through events that would have crushed many people. There was war, hunger, deep loss, and the deaths of her parents, her sisters and her brothers, one after another. She also lost 2 of her own children, taken by sickness before they reached the age of 10. Yet she was never bitter. That is what stays with me the most about her. After all she endured, after all the sorrow and pain, she did not turn hard or angry. Instead, she chose gratitude. She was thankful for the years she was given, thankful for the family she loved so deeply, thankful for the country she lived to see come into existence. She once told me that suffering teaches you what truly matters in life. She said that when you have known hunger, every meal feels like a blessing. When you have lost people you love, you hold even tighter to those who remain. When you have watched your whole world fall apart and then slowly be rebuilt, you learn that nothing lasts forever, and because of that, each moment becomes priceless. My grandmother married later than most women of her time. She was 38 years old when she married my grandfather, Ezra Caldwell, who was a widower with 2 children. She took those children into her heart and raised them as if they were her own. Later she had 2 more children, one of them being my mother. She often said she never believed she would marry at all and had stopped hoping for it. But Ezra changed that for her. She said he was gentle and kind. He had also fought in the war, though he rarely spoke about it. They shared an understanding that did not need many words. She was 40 years old when my mother was born, which was considered old and risky for a first child. But both she and my mother survived, and because of that I am here to tell this story. I was born in 1839, when my grandmother was already 77 years old. She was old by any standard, slow in her movements, fragile in body, and full of memories. Yet her mind remained sharp, sharp as ever. My mother used to say that she remembered everything, every small detail of her long life, stored away like treasures locked inside a chest. I spent as much time with her as I could. I would sit at her feet while she rocked back and forth in her chair, and I would beg her to tell me stories. I would ask her to tell me about the old days, about the time before everything changed. She would smile that gentle smile of hers and begin to speak, and as she did, the years seemed to disappear. Suddenly I was carried into a world I had never known. A world of muskets and candlelight, of King George's portrait hanging on the wall of the meeting house. Her voice would change when she told those stories. It became softer, almost younger, as if she were not just remembering the past but living it again. It felt as though a part of her still sat by the fire in that old house, learning to spin wool and reading the Bible by candlelight. I learned how to ask questions that pulled out details she might otherwise leave behind. I asked her what her mother's bread tasted like. I asked about the color of her sister's hair. I asked what songs they sang in the meeting house. She loved these questions. Her eyes would brighten, and she would think deeply, reaching back across many years to find those forgotten details. Sometimes she would close her eyes and sit quietly for a long moment, and then she would smile and say she had forgotten that memory and thank me for helping her remember. Looking back, I know I was selfish with her time. My brothers and sisters wanted to play outside, to run and laugh and do what children usually do. But I wanted to stay beside my grandmother. I wanted to hear every story, learn every detail, and hold on to every memory before it disappeared. My mother would gently scold me and tell me to let my grandmother rest, saying she was tired. But my grandmother would wave her hand and say to let the child stay. She said she had so few years left and wanted to spend them remembering. She taught me lessons that had nothing to do with dates or battles or history books. She taught me how to truly see the world, how to pay attention, and how to notice the small things most people miss. She pointed out how light falls through a window, how rain sounds on a roof, how bread smells while baking. She said most people rush through life without really seeing anything. They are too busy worrying about tomorrow to notice today. She told me every moment is precious and every moment is a gift, and she warned me not to waste them. I have tried to live by those words. I have tried to see the world the way she taught me, with care, gratitude, and wonder. She told me about a world I could barely imagine, a world without the United States, a world where this land was only a group of colonies ruled by a king who lived far across the ocean, a world where the future we now accept as normal was only a dream in the minds of a few people. She described what it felt like to watch that dream slowly become real, to see a nation born, to grow up alongside it, and to watch it struggle and learn how to stand on its own. She told me that I lived in a real country now, with laws, a government, and a flag. But she remembered a time when there was no flag, no government, and no country, only people trying to understand what freedom truly meant. I once asked her if she missed the old days, the time before the war, before the revolution, before everything changed. She thought for a long time before answering. She said she missed her father and her mother. She missed her sisters who died young and the people she loved who were now gone. But she did not miss being English, and she did not miss the king. She said they had built something better, something worth all the fear, pain, and long years of war. They created a place where people could be free. She passed away in the spring of 1848 when I was 9 years old. I sat beside her bed and held her hand as she slowly slipped away. Her hand felt thin and light, like holding dry sticks wrapped in paper. The room was quiet except for her breathing, which grew slower as time passed. My parents and my sisters were there, and we took turns holding her hand, telling her we loved her, and thanking her for all she had given us. I did not want her to leave. I remember wishing she would stay just a little longer and tell me one last story. But even at 9 years old, I knew her time had come and that she was ready. Near the end, she opened her eyes one last time and looked at each of us carefully, as if she were fixing our faces in her memory. When she looked at me, she smiled that soft smile I loved so much. Her final words were about her father. She wondered if he was waiting for her and if he was proud of her. I liked to believe he was waiting, ready to welcome her home and tell her that everything had been worth it. The tea in the harbor, the shots fired at Lexington, and the long years of war, all of it. We buried her in the churchyard beside her husband and the children she had lost before her. The minister spoke of resurrection and eternal life, but I barely heard him. My thoughts were filled with her stories and the memories she had placed in my care. In the days after her death, I walked through the village and saw it differently. These were the paths she walked as a girl. These were the places where she hid from British soldiers. This was where she watched a nation come into being. The ground beneath my feet felt sacred because of her footsteps. My grandmother lived 86 years. She witnessed the birth of a nation and watched it grow from a fragile idea into a strong country. She remembered what it meant to be English and what it meant to become American. She carried both worlds inside her and passed them on to me. I am 90 years old now, with great-grandchildren who will never fully understand what it took to build this country. Still, I tell them the stories the same way my grandmother told me. I tell them about Prudence Hartwell, born in 1762 in a world without America, who saw that world end and a new one begin. My great-grandchildren live in a time of automobiles and electric lights. They accept things that would have seemed like magic to my grandmother. They turn a switch and light appears. They turn a handle and water flows. They lift a telephone and speak to someone far away. I often wonder what my grandmother would think of this world. I believe she would feel amazed, a little afraid, and deeply delighted. Most of all, I think she would feel proud. Proud of the country she saw born and proud that the dream her father fought for still lives. But I also believe she would warn us not to take it lightly. She would remind us that freedom is fragile and must be protected, and that every generation must earn it again. That is the lesson she gave me, and the one I have tried to pass on. Freedom is not free. Everything we have was bought with sacrifice. We owe a debt to those who came before us, and the only way to repay it is to protect what they built. When people ask why I spend so much time speaking of the past, I tell them it is because the past never truly leaves us. Every freedom and every right we enjoy exists because someone fought and suffered for it. Someone hid in fear, praying for a future they could not see. My grandmother was one of those people, and I want her to be remembered. I want her story to live on. I have seen much in my 90 years. I have seen this country torn apart by civil war and brought back together. I have seen it grow into a powerful nation. I have witnessed wonders my grandmother could never have imagined. Yet nothing is more precious to me than the memories she shared with me, the stories of a world before America and the stories of how this country came to be. She used to say that history is simply stories, passed down from one generation to the next, generation shifting the words just a little each time, but holding on to what truly matters, the parts that shape us, the parts that teach us who we are and where we began. I have done my best to keep her stories breathing. I have tried to share them the same way she once shared them with me, and now I give them to you, so that one day you may give them to someone else, so that Prudence Hartwell, born in the year 1762, is never lost to time. This is what I owe her. This is what all of us owe those who lived before us. We owe them our memory, our voices, our care. We owe them their stories kept alive in our hearts and spoken through our words. My grandmother remembered a life from before America existed. I remember her, and as long as air fills my lungs, I will keep telling her story. The world she entered at birth is no longer here. It has faded like early fog, like smoke rising from a candle and disappearing. But her words are still here. Her memories still remain, and through those memories a small piece of that vanished world still lives. A world before America. A world where life moved differently. A world my grandmother carried inside her until her final day, and a world I still carry within me. When I shut my eyes I can see her clearly, sitting in her rocking chair near the window, soft afternoon light resting gently on her face. Her eyes dimmed by age but bright with remembrance, her hands, thin and freckled, resting quietly in her lap. I can hear her voice, calm and slow, each word drifting toward me from far away, from a place outside of time itself. She told me about a world I would never know with my own eyes, a world she wanted me to remember for her. And I do remember. After 90 years I remember every story, every small detail, every word she ever spoke. They live inside me now, stitched into who I am. I could not forget them even if I tried. That is the strength of stories. They last longer than we do. They carry parts of us forward into the future, long after our bodies are gone. My grandmother's stories have lived inside me for 80 years. Now I am giving them to you, and maybe you will pass them along to someone else. That is how we continue. That is how we face death and refuse to let it win, not by living forever, but by handing our stories to those who come next. By trusting them to remember us. I hope I have honored her well. I hope I have helped you see her, even just a little. A young girl in Massachusetts watching the world shift around her. An old woman in a rocking chair sharing stories with a child. A living bridge between two worlds, two times, two Americas. She was my grandmother. She was Prudence Hartwell. She remembered things no one alive today can remember. That is a gift, a rare and precious gift, and I will hold it close until the day I join her.